the courtroom drama surrounding Blake Lively has taken a turn. No one saw coming as a new wave of tension emerges, not from the legal documents or courtroom testimony, but from the very reporters who have been covering this case from the start. Journalists, who once approached the trial with professional neutrality, are now breaking their silence, revealing a disturbing pattern of conduct from Blake Lively's legal team that they claim goes far beyond aggressive strategy and enters the realm of outright intimidation, veiled threats, and shocking rudeness. It is not just one reporter making these claims, it is several, all from different outlets, backgrounds, and platforms. And their stories are eerily similar. They speak of being dismissed, shut out, silenced, and in some cases, even subtly warned against covering the case in ways that would make Blake or her lawyers look bad. The question now being asked across the media landscape is simple. Have Blake Lively's lawyers gone too far? What began as a high-profile dispute between Hollywood figures has now become a case study in media control, legal overreach, and the dangerous power imbalance between celebrity legal machines and the free press. And the timing could not be worse for Blake Lively, whose public image is already under siege as court documents pile up, leaked messages make headlines, and inconsistencies in her legal narrative raise even more eyebrows. Insiders are calling this moment a media meltdown, one where the tactics used by her team to manage the fallout are only adding fuel to the fire and making everything worse. Legal commentators are now openly asking whether this approach is sustainable and if it could hurt her case in the long run. Because when lawyers are seen as bullies rather than defenders, the court of public opinion takes notice. And sometimes even real courts start asking questions too. More than ever, the walls appear to be closing in, not just around the legal case, but around the very people who were supposed to control the narrative and keep Blake protected from scrutiny. Now the story has changed, and the press is no longer just covering the case, they have become part of it. And with every new report, every new account of rudeness, hostility, or blocked access, the pressure mounts and the spotlight grows hotter. The legal world is watching the media. World is documenting, and the public is beginning to wonder what Blake Lively's team is really hiding. Because if you are doing everything, right? Why would you try to silence those asking questions? This is not just a legal battle anymore. It is a showdown between power and truth. And in this game, the truth is fighting back harder than ever before. Blake Lively is once again at the center of an escalating media storm, as new reports suggest that her legal team may have crossed a line in their aggressive handling of the ongoing legal feud with Justin Baldoni. And now multiple reporters who have covered the case since the beginning are stepping forward with claims that are raising even more questions about the lengths her attorneys are willing to go. To silence critics, control the narrative, and intimidate those who simply ask the wrong questions or press a little too hard on the uncomfortable details of this ever-expanding scandal. What began as a legal dispute over alleged defamation and public misrepresentation has now spiraled into something much darker and far more telling than any tabloid headline or Hollywood gossip segment could possibly capture. Because according to sources who spoke on condition of anonymity, as well as some who have gone fully on record, the behavior of Blake Lively's legal representatives is no longer just about protecting their client. It is now being viewed as a coordinated effort to stifle dissent and discourage transparency, using a mix of legal pressure, personal intimidation, and in some cases outright rudeness that has reportedly shocked even the most seasoned court reporters in Los Angeles. What makes this even more intense is that these complaints are not coming from random voices on social media or anonymous internet blogs. They are coming from credentialed members of the press who have attended court hearings, read filings, and in some cases directly communicated with both sides of the case. One veteran legal journalist who has covered dozens of high-profile Hollywood trials over the years described the atmosphere around the Lively legal team as one of, quote, sustained hostility, end quote, noting that the attorneys representing her appear less interested in defending a position and more invested in silencing coverage altogether. And while aggressive legal tactics are nothing new in celebrity litigation, especially in high-stakes, image-driven disputes, the tone and tactics being described, in this case, go far beyond the norm, according to one reporter who was allegedly blocked from entering a recent court session due to, quote, space constraints, end quote. Despite having a valid press credential and prior approval, the decision to limit access appeared selective, and the reporter claims that they were told by a staff member unofficially that Lively's team had concerns about their reporting style, which was seen as overly critical, or too focused on procedural missteps. Another source says that questions emailed to the Lively legal office were met with sharp dismissals, and that follow-up inquiries were responded to with what they described as thinly veiled threats of legal consequences if any part of the story portrayed their client in a negative light. And while none of this is illegal per se, the effect is chilling, according to multiple media experts who say that when celebrities use their legal power not just to defend but to intimidate, it sets a dangerous precedent, especially in an era where the line between journalism and content creation is increasingly blurred, and where many reporters now operate independently or with limited institutional protection. This power imbalance becomes even more glaring when celebrities with vast resources and high-profile legal firms begin targeting individuals rather than institutions. It sends a clear message that access will be restricted, criticism will be punished, and only flattering narratives will be tolerated. And in this particular case, the timing could not be more telling, because it comes on the heels of leaked documents suggesting that Lively may have personally approved communications targeting Baldoni in ways that contradict her public statements and her legal arguments. These revelations have already shaken the credibility of her broader claims, and have put renewed focus on what her lawyers are really trying to suppress. Some observers say the recent shift in tone from the Lively team may reflect internal panic, or at least growing concern that the narrative is slipping out of their control, as more people both inside and outside the courtroom begin to question the motivations behind the legal moves being made. One public relations consultant who has worked with high-profile clients in similar crises told us that when lawyers start snapping at reporters or restricting access, it is almost always a sign that they are trying to control a story that is already unraveling, and in many ways that appears to be exactly what is happening here. Because the more the legal team pushes back, the more questions arise about what they are really afraid of being exposed, and if history is any guide, this kind of suppression rarely works in the long term. Because once the press gets a whiff of coordinated resistance, the story often grows even faster and becomes even more damaging, especially when it is being documented in real time by journalists, influencers, legal analysts, and even some fans who have taken it upon themselves to review filings, attend hearings, and speak directly to attorneys on both sides. The irony, of course, is that the very attempts to control coverage are what often make it more controversial, more high-profile, and ultimately more difficult to manage. Because when a celebrity or their team is accused of hostility toward the press, it creates a ripple effect across the entertainment media landscape, prompting others who might have stayed quiet to come forward with their own experiences. And that is exactly what seems to be happening now as more reporters begin to corroborate the idea that this legal team is not just playing hardball, they are actively working to create an environment of fear and silence. And this revelation could not have come at a worse time for Blake Lively, whose reputation in Hollywood is already under intense scrutiny as the public fallout from this case continues to grow louder and more personal. The shift in tone from fair coverage to adversarial confrontation may end up backfiring, especially if it leads to even more unflattering revelations from those who were previously on the sidelines and now feel emboldened to speak up. There is also the question of judicial optics, because judges do not look kindly on parties who are perceived to be manipulating the media or attempting to chill lawful press coverage of open proceedings. And while no formal complaints have been filed yet, the whispers within the legal community suggest that if this trend continues, it could trigger a formal inquiry or, at the very least, make judges more skeptical of the arguments being made by the Lively team in court. And if that happens, the consequences could be severe, not just in terms of public perception, but in actual legal outcomes, because credibility matters in court. And when lawyers are seen as overreaching or disrespectful, it can color the way a judge views their entire case. And let us not forget that this entire situation began with a credibility crisis around conflicting stories, unclear timelines, and aggressive media statements, all of which have now come full circle, as the very tactics used to manage that crisis are being challenged as part of a new crisis, one that may be even harder to manage because it involves the professional conduct of those who are supposed to bring calm and clarity to a chaotic moment. In short, what we are witnessing now is not just a celebrity legal battle. It is a war over who controls the truth, who gets to speak and who must remain silent. And in that battle, The press is not just an observer, it is now a direct participant and potentially a target. And that changes everything. Because once the Fourth Estate is under fire, the story stops being about he said, she said, and starts becoming about something far more urgent and far more consequential for everyone involved, especially those with the most to lose when silence fails to hold back the truth. As the legal firestorm surrounding Blake Lively continues to escalate, it is becoming increasingly clear that this is no longer just a case about defamation or personal grievances. It has evolved into a full-scale battle over control narrative, shaping and the misuse of legal power to dictate how stories are told. Who gets to tell them and what consequences follow when someone dares to tell the wrong version in this new chapter? Reporters are not just witnesses to the drama, they are now players in the unfolding war, with several respected journalists speaking openly about the rude, dismissive, and sometimes even threatening behavior they say they have faced while covering this case. One longtime courthouse correspondent described an incident in which a member of the Lively legal team allegedly confronted them in the hallway after a hearing, criticizing their story as biased and warning them not to, quote, push an agenda. End quote. The reporter says they were stunned, not only by the tone of the message, but by the implication that any critical coverage would be punished professionally or possibly even legally, and while no lawsuit has yet been filed against a member of the press. In this case, the veiled threats, the sharp tone, and the documented attempts to limit press access are painting a picture that is becoming harder for Blake Lively's camp to defend or explain, especially as more journalists from different outlets start to echo similar experiences. These are not isolated complaints. These are patterns, and in the world of media, patterns matter because they reveal intent. And according to a growing chorus of voices, that intent appears to be clear silence, criticism, stifle inquiry, and shift attention away from the inconsistencies in the case itself. But as with many attempts to control a story through aggression or intimidation, the strategy seems to be backfiring spectacularly as the press becomes more galvanized, more focused, and frankly more determined to dig even deeper into what this case is really about. Who is behind the scenes making the calls, and why the behavior from the legal side has grown so adversarial. In such a short time, legal experts we spoke with say that this kind of escalation rarely happens by accident. It is usually the result of internal pressure, anxiety, or a sense that the facts are no longer working in their favor. And when that happens, they say, lawyers sometimes lash out at the easiest target, which in many cases is the press itself, especially those reporters who have covered the case closely enough to notice contradictions or inconsistencies, or who have published stories that highlight uncomfortable truths that contradict the public narrative. The problem for Blake Lively is that her legal team now appears to be developing a reputation among journalists that may prove very difficult to reverse. Once a legal office becomes known for hostility or obstruction, reporters tend to close ranks. They compare notes, they share sources, and they begin to treat the case not just as news, but as a matter of professional concern. And that is exactly what seems to be happening. Now, in fact, some reporters have now begun drafting a joint letter intended for court officials and legal observers, documenting the pattern of behavior and calling for clarity around press access protocols moving forward. If such a letter is submitted, it could have serious consequences, not just for the current case, but for how future hearings are conducted, especially if the court finds that press freedoms were restricted unfairly or without proper justification. In one particularly striking example, a well-known legal blogger who has covered multiple celebrity trials posted a lengthy thread describing how they were asked to leave a public hallway outside the courtroom at the request of someone affiliated with the Lively legal team. Although no names were given, the implication was clear. The team did not want that blogger in the vicinity of the proceedings, and the blogger, who had a valid credential and was not disrupting anything, described the moment as surreal and deeply concerning, noting that they had never experienced anything like it in their years of court coverage. And if that were the only story, it might be easy to dismiss as a misunderstanding or an overreaction, but it is not the only story, and that is what makes this so serious. Multiple journalists from different outlets have reported being stonewalled, ignored, or subtly threatened when they attempted to ask questions about procedural matters, about filings, or about the tone of certain statements made in court or in public. One reporter recounted how their request for Clarification about a document was answered with a cold response that included a reminder of the, quote, reputational risk, end quote, of misrepresenting facts in public, even though the original question had simply been about the timing of a motion, and not about any interpretation or opinion. And that kind of language, when it comes from a legal team as high-profile and well-funded as the one representing Blake, Lively carries weight, and more importantly, it carries a message. That message, according to media analysts, is clear: stop asking questions or face consequences. And that is where this situation becomes more than just another Hollywood feud, because the ability of the press to freely report on legal matters, especially in open court, is a fundamental part of the legal process. It ensures transparency, accountability, and a fair record for the public. And when that freedom is threatened or undermined by aggressive tactics, it does more than just ruffle feathers. It weakens the entire system and creates a chilling effect that can discourage others from even trying to report on sensitive cases in the future. And while Lively herself has not publicly commented on these reports of hostility or intimidation, the silence from her camp has not gone unnoticed, and in some corners is being interpreted as tacit approval of the behavior being described, and that silence is quickly becoming a story of its own, especially as the press begins to turn more attention to the question of who exactly is orchestrating the legal strategy, what motivations are driving these decisions, and how much of the aggression is reactive versus calculated. One publicist with ties to several Hollywood legal teams described the situation as, quote, a textbook overcorrection, end quote, arguing that Lively's team likely saw the backlash building and chose to fight back hard instead of regrouping quietly and reassessing the strategy. And while that approach may have satisfied some internal voices, pushing for a tougher stance, it is now causing even more reputational damage than the original controversy. Because when you go after the press, you invite a level of scrutiny that few public figures can withstand, and that is the irony at the heart of this whole drama. By trying to control the story, the legal team may have ensured that it spirals even further out of their control. And in a media landscape already saturated with speculation, commentary, and fast-moving coverage, the decision to challenge journalists directly is not just bold, it is reckless. Because once that line is crossed, the press no longer sees itself as a neutral observer, but as a stakeholder in the fight. And in this fight, the press has the advantage because they have the platform, they have the audience, and more importantly, they have the receipts in the form of emails, transcripts, access denials, and on-the-record statements from others in the media who have experienced similar treatment. And if even a fraction of these stories are documented and confirmed, it could lead to formal media complaints, internal investigations, and possibly even legal challenges around public access and courtroom transparency. And that could complicate things for Blake Lively in ways her team may not have anticipated, because courts do not operate in a vacuum, and judges are not immune to public scrutiny, especially when it comes to issues of fairness, transparency, and access. And if it appears that one side is trying to gain an unfair advantage by restricting coverage or intimidating reporters, that can and often does affect the way motions are viewed, the way testimony is evaluated, and ultimately the way the case unfolds. And while Blake Lively remains a powerful figure with significant resources, the tide of public opinion is a force no one can fully control, especially when the people shaping that opinion are no longer interested in playing nice, and instead feel compelled to fight back. As the dust begins to settle around the firestorm that has erupted from within Blake Lively's legal team, one thing is becoming undeniably clear: the tactics being used to control the flow of information, intimidate reporters, and pressure the press into silence have not only failed but backfired in the most spectacular way. Instead of protecting Blake Lively from scrutiny, these actions have drawn even more attention to her case, magnifying every questionable move, every harsh email, every blocked press request, and every dismissive exchange with a journalist. That attention has not only spread across traditional media channels, but has also gone viral online, triggering a wave of public commentary, backlash, and investigative curiosity that no PR team or legal strategist can now contain. In trying to tighten their grip, they have lost control altogether. And this loss of control matters because in a high-stakes legal and public relations battle like this, one perception is often just as important as fact. And when the perception becomes one of suppression, overreach, and arrogance, the narrative quickly shifts from sympathy to skepticism. And once that skepticism takes root, it spreads, especially in an environment where transparency, is valued and where the press is more empowered than ever to speak up, push back, and dig deeper into what is really going on behind the scenes. For Blake Lively, this moment represents a critical turning point, not just in her legal case, but in her public legacy. If her team continues down the path of confrontation rather than correction, they may find themselves facing not just legal opposition, but institutional media resistance that could make every future move 10 times harder to manage. But if there is any silver lining in this media fallout, it is that it has sparked a broader conversation about how powerful figures use their influence to shape coverage, and how important it is for the press to remain vigilant, vocal, and unafraid. The reporters who have come forward in this case have not only highlighted a troubling pattern of behavior, they have reminded everyone why journalism matters and why unchecked power, no matter how well-dressed or beautifully framed, must always be challenged, because the truth does not require silence to stand, and no legal strategy should ever be built on the foundation of fear. In the end, this case may still take many twists and turns, but what will be remembered most is not just the outcome in court, but the way those involved treated the process, the people covering it, and the public watching it all unfold. And right now, the spotlight is no longer just on the plaintiff or the defendant. It is on the very institutions meant to support justice, fairness, and accountability, and that spotlight will not dim anytime soon.